Medieval wars, those grand conflicts that conjure images of knights in gleaming armor, castles under siege, banners fluttering in the wind, trumpets echoing in the distance, and battles that seem straight out of an epic painting or a fantasy film, have one characteristic that never fails to astonish: their duration. These weren't skirmishes resolved in a couple of days, or even months, as we might imagine with modern wars, with their lightning-fast strategies, roaring tanks, and planes streaking across the sky. We're talking about clashes that could drag on for years, decades, or even centuries, as if time were an infinite resource and combatants had all day to swing their swords. The 100 Years' War, for instance, didn't last exactly 100 years but 116, from 1337 to 1453, with intermittent pauses that were like commercial breaks in an endless soap opera. The fighters took a breather, sharpened their swords, ate something stale, grumbled about the mud in their boots, and returned to the battlefield with renewed enthusiasm to keep fighting. Why were these wars so long? What made a medieval conflict turn into a never-ending war drama, like a TV series that keeps churning out seasons even when the fans are already exhausted? Let's dive into this mystery with an informative tone, spiced with a touch of humor that doesn't go overboard. Because, let's be honest, the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a time when people settled their differences with a calm chat, a cup of tea, and a handshake. To understand why medieval wars lasted so long, we first need to set the scene in the Middle Ages, a period roughly spanning from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th century, though historians always argue about the exact dates, like a group of friends bickering over who ordered the last beer at the bar. This was a fragmented world, a chaotic mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, counties, lordships, fiefs, and even tiny territories ruled by nobles with more ambition than common sense. There was no clear concept of a nation as we understand it today, with defined borders and a central government saying, "This is mine, and that's yours." Borders were more like suggestions, fuzzy lines that changed hands as easily as gossip in a small village. A noble could swear loyalty to one king one day and decide the next to ally with another because they offered a bigger castle, more fertile lands, a better dowered wife, or simply because the neighbor gave them a dirty look at a banquet, probably over not sharing the wine. This political fragmentation turned wars into a tangle of personal interests, shifting alliances, and betrayals that would make any intrigue-filled TV series writer jealous. Every feudal lord had their own little empire, and coordinating all these egos to fight for a common cause was like trying to get a group of cats to march in formation while chasing a laser pointer. One of the main factors that prolonged medieval wars was logistics, or rather, the lack of efficient logistics. Today, a modern army can mobilize thousands of soldiers in hours, with planes, trains, trucks, and drones loaded with provisions, weapons, medical supplies, and cutting-edge technology. In the Middle Ages, moving an army was like organizing an intercontinental move without trucks, GPS, paved roads, or a group of people who'd rather be home plowing their fields or tending their cows. Soldiers were mostly peasants conscripted by feudal lords, and these peasants weren't always thrilled about leaving their crops, families, and villages to fight hundreds of kilometers away over a dispute that, frankly, mattered to them about as much as the price of wheat in a neighboring kingdom. Transporting food, weapons, armor, tents, tools, horse fodder, and even heavy siege equipment required ox, or mule-drawn carts that moved at a pace that would make a tortoise look like a race car on a highway. A 100-kilometer journey could take weeks, and if it rained, which, in the Middle Ages, happened with a frequency that made you suspect the sky had a personal vendetta against humanity, the roads turned into muddy swamps that trapped carts, horses, soldiers, and everyone's patience. An army could get stuck for days just because a bridge collapsed or a river overflowed, and there was no tow truck or civil engineer to fix the problem. Food was a constant headache. There were no supermarkets, canned goods, refrigerators, delivery services, or even a decent bag to keep bread fresh. Armies relied on looting nearby villages, collecting tributes from peasants, or carrying provisions that spoiled within days, especially in summer, when heat turned meat into a biological experiment and bread into a rock. If a commander didn't plan well, their troops could end up eating grass, roots, tree bark, or, in desperate cases, their own horses, which was not only a morale crusher but also a strategic disaster. A knight without a horse was like a chef without a knife or a troubadour without a lute, useless in their primary role. That's why many campaigns halted in winter, when fields were frozen, crops weren't growing, and provisions were scarce. Armies retreated to their fortresses, castles, or camps, licked their wounds, repaired their armor, counted their coins, and waited for spring to resume fighting. These seasonal pauses could stretch a war out indefinitely, because nobody wanted to fight on an empty stomach, with frozen feet, armor that felt like a portable fridge, and a mood that made the devil himself seem cheerful. Winter didn't just affect soldiers, it also hit pack animals, which could get sick, die, or simply refuse to move, leaving the army without means to transport provisions or their precious siege machines. Another key factor was the nature of combat itself. Pitched battles, those grand confrontations we imagine with hundreds of knights charging with lances, heroic shouts, banners waving, and an epic choir in the background, were actually quite rare. Most medieval wars were fought through sieges, the medieval equivalent of a chess match played in slow motion with deadly stakes and a board full of mud. Besieging a castle or fortified city was a long, tedious process, sometimes more boring than an endless work meeting where everyone talks but nothing gets decided. Building siege machines like catapults, assault towers, battering rams, or trebuchets took weeks, and that was if you had good quality wood, proper tools, carpenters who knew what they were doing, and a bit of luck to keep everything from breaking on the first try. Meanwhile, defenders weren't sitting idle. From the battlements, they could hurl stones, arrows, boiling oil, burning pitch, excrement, or anything else they had on hand, which was not only unpleasant but surprisingly effective at demoralizing attackers. Imagine spending weeks building a siege tower only to have a bucket of something unmentionable dumped on you. A siege could last months or even years, like the famous siege of Harfleur in 1415, which lasted only a few weeks but was an exception. Often, besiegers gave up before the besieged, running out of food, morale, patience, or because a disease decided to crash the party and decimate the troops like an uninvited but highly effective guest. Speaking of diseases, the Middle Ages was hardly a sanitary paradise. Military camps were like an all-you-can-eat buffet for epidemics, a place where bacteria and viruses held their own crusades. Without modern medical knowledge, a small wound could get infected and send a soldier to the afterlife in days. Dysentery, typhus, the bubonic plague, typhoid fever, and other diseases could wipe out an army faster than any sword-wielding enemy. During the 100 Years' War, for example, diseases killed more soldiers than battles did. Camps lacked basic sanitation, clean water was hard to come by, soldiers slept crammed in damp tents, and the concept of hand-washing was as alien as a dragon at a market. This forced commanders to be extremely cautious, delaying campaigns to avoid unnecessary losses. Nobody wanted to lead an army of ghosts before even reaching the battlefield. Unsanitary conditions, lack of hygiene, absence of trained doctors, and the belief that miasmas, bad smells, caused diseases turned every camp into a constant risk, and wars dragged on because armies needed time to recover from these non-combat losses. A general could have the best strategy in the world, but if half his men were sick, his plan would fall apart faster than a cart on a muddy road. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores it further. The economy also played a crucial role in war duration. Medieval wars were insanely expensive, and there were no banks, credit cards, quick loans, or crowdfunding campaigns to fund them. Kings and nobles relied on taxes from their lands, which were often insufficient, or borrowing from wealthy merchants, who weren't always eager to part with their money without solid guarantees, like a castle, a city, or a promise of lands they'd probably never see. To keep an army in the field, a king needed to plunder enemy territories, capture hostages for ransom, sell political favors, or, in some cases, literally pawn the crown jewels. Raiding a village could yield food, gold, and valuables, but it also angered peasants, who might rebel, refuse to pay more taxes, or join the enemy out of sheer desperation. Ransoms, though lucrative, depended on capturing a high-value noble, and there wasn't always one available, as nobles weren't foolish enough to stand in the front line if they could avoid it. Often, a conflict paused because both sides ran out of funds, like two friends planning a big party but realizing they only have enough money for a bottle of soda and some stale chips. These financial pauses could last months or years while leaders raised more money, negotiated alliances, tried to convince peasants to pay more taxes without sparking a revolt, or resorted to creative methods like selling indulgences or promising divine favors. The politics of the time also prolonged wars. In the Middle Ages, conflicts weren't always fought to conquer territory or resources, but over matters of honor, dynastic rights, personal vendettas, or because someone offended someone else at a feast. A king might declare war because he believed he had a legitimate claim to another kingdom's throne, as Edward III of England did, sparking the 100 Years' War by claiming the French throne. These dynastic disputes were like a chess game played by players who didn't fully know the rules, moved pieces when no one was looking, and occasionally flipped the board in a fit of rage. Alliances shifted constantly, and a noble fighting for one king today might switch sides tomorrow for a better deal, a grander title, richer lands, a wealthy wife, or even a seaside castle. This lack of loyalty prolonged wars because no one trusted anyone, and every peace treaty was more fragile than a cookie in a hiker's backpack. A treaty might be signed with great pomp, sealed parchments, solemn oaths, and lavish feasts, but a single insult at court, a poorly planned marriage, an unexpected betrayal, or even a malicious rumor could unravel everything. Hey, if you're enjoying this explanation and want to keep learning about the Middle Ages with a dash of humor, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that red button, it doesn't bite, and join the community of curious folks who want to know more about the past without falling asleep. Military tactics also played a significant role. Medieval armies weren't professional like today's. Most soldiers were peasants who wielded a sword, spear, pitchfork, or whatever was at hand with more enthusiasm than skill. Knights, the military elite, were better trained but few in number and costly to maintain. A knight needed full armor that cost a fortune, a warhorse that ate more than a whole village, a squire to help him suit up, and enough provisions to stay in fighting shape, making him a high-maintenance investment, like a luxury car needing premium fuel, constant tune-ups, and a heated garage. This meant armies avoided direct confrontations unless victory was certain, as a defeat could be catastrophic, not just for the loss of lives but for the economic cost of replacing knights, horses, and equipment. Instead of decisive battles, commanders favored attrition tactics. Burning crops, razing villages, cutting enemy supply lines, poisoning wells, and generally making life miserable for everyone involved. This strategy, known as chevauchee in the 100 Years' War, didn't aim to seize territory but to weaken the enemy until they surrendered from exhaustion. It was like a game of cat and mouse, but with swords, torches, arrows, and no cheese. Military technology also slowed conflicts down. The main weapons were swords, spears, bows, crossbows, and later, primitive artillery like gunpowder cannons that seemed more like scientific experiments than reliable weapons. These were effective but not revolutionary. A crossbow could pierce armor but took so long to reload that the archer had to hide behind a shield or risk becoming an easy target. Longbows, like those used by the English at Crécy and Agincourt, were faster but required years of training to master, and not every army could afford such specialized archers. Armor, while impressive, was heavy and cumbersome, slowing battles and exhausting fighters. A fully armored knight might be nearly invulnerable to arrows, but if he fell off his horse, got stuck in the mud, or tired after half an hour of fighting, he became a metal turtle, vulnerable and, frankly, a bit ridiculous. Siege machines like catapults, rams, mangonels, or trebuchets were fearsome but required skilled engineers, quality wood, sturdy ropes, and weeks of work to build. A well-fortified castle with thick walls, deep moats, reinforced gates, watchtowers, and ample provisions could withstand years of siege, like Carcassonne in France, Dover in England, or Croc de Chevaliers in the Holy Land, which were practically impregnable fortresses. Attackers might try undermining walls by digging tunnels to collapse them, but this took months and didn't always work, as defenders could counter with their own tunnels, set enemy tunnels on fire, flood them with water, or simply wait for the attackers to run out of food and go home. The medieval mindset also influenced war duration. War wasn't always seen as something to be resolved quickly. For many nobles, fighting was a way of life, a means to gain prestige, lands, titles, wealth, wives, allies, or even divine favor. Religion played a big role, and some believed fighting for a just cause pleased God, though God probably would have preferred they settled things with a card game, a mass, a good talk, or at least an honorable duel instead of razing entire villages. The Crusades, for example, lasted generations because religious and political leaders saw them as sacred missions to secure a place in heaven while also grabbing land, loot, and prestige on earth. This warrior mentality perpetuated conflicts, as no one wanted to be the first to surrender and risk looking weak, cowardly, or, worst of all, dishonorable. A noble who surrendered without a fight could lose the respect of their peers, and in a society where honor was worth more than gold, that was a fate worse than death, exile, or a bad harvest. Communication, or the lack thereof, was another major hurdle. Sending a message from one kingdom to another could take weeks, assuming the messenger didn't get lost, attacked by bandits, fall off their horse, drown crossing a river, or decide they'd rather stay at a tavern with a beer, some stale bread, and a good story. There were no phones, emails, reliable smoke signals, or carrier pigeons as effective as movies make them seem. Messages were written on parchments that could get wet, tear, become illegible, be intercepted by enemies, or, worst of all, be misread because medieval handwriting wasn't exactly a model of clarity. Messengers weren't always trustworthy and could be bribed, switch sides, or vanish with the message and horse. This made coordinating a ceasefire, surrender, peace negotiation, or even a simple meeting a complex process. Agreements often fell apart because one side didn't get the message in time, misunderstood it, disagreed with the terms, or just didn't like the deal because the parchment smelled funny. Imagine trying to plan a dinner with friends without WhatsApp, but instead of picking a menu, you're deciding the fate of a kingdom, a dynasty, or a castle. That's how chaotic medieval communication was. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores it further. The lack of centralized power also prolonged wars. In the Middle Ages, there was no UN, NATO, EU, or international body to mediate conflicts. Kings and nobles settled disputes their way, and if a feudal lord ignored their king's orders, there wasn't much the king could do except send an army to punish them, sparking yet another conflict, as if the original problem wasn't complicated enough. This decentralization made wars like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appeared, each with its own feudal lord, army, and personal grudges. The Wars of the Roses in England, from 1455 to 1487, is a prime example, with factions like the Lancasters and Yorks fighting for the throne in a chaos of betrayals, battles, executions, conspiracies, and side-switching that seemed endless. Every time one side seemed to win, a new contender emerged. A distant cousin, a forgotten nephew, a supposed heir, or even an impostor claiming the throne, and the cycle started anew. This lack of political cohesion fragmented conflicts into multiple fronts, each with its own leaders, goals, personal feuds, and family dramas that felt like a soap opera. Mercenaries deserve a special mention too. Many medieval armies hired mercenaries to bolster their ranks, especially in long conflicts like the 100 Years' War. These hired soldiers were effective, being trained professionals with no personal loyalties tying them to a king, noble, or cause. But they were also problematic. If not paid on time, they could desert, join the enemy, loot both sides, or worse, turn into bandits and form their own armed gangs, like the Free Companies, which became such a problem that kings had to team up temporarily to deal with them. Managing mercenaries was like trying to tame a wild cat. You could try, but you'd likely end up scratched, betrayed, or with a looted camp. Their presence added another layer of complexity to wars, as commanders had to deal not only with the enemy but also with their own soldiers, who were sometimes more loyal to gold, beer, or freedom than to the cause they were supposed to fight for. Climate also played a significant role. The Middle Ages saw notable climate shifts, like the medieval warm period from the 10th to 13th centuries, which brought warmer temperatures, better harvests, but also more conflicts over fertile land, and the Little Ice Age, starting late in the medieval period, which brought harsher winters, unpredictable summers, and poorer harvests. A bad harvest year could weaken an entire kingdom, making it impossible to keep an army in the field. Commanders had to plan campaigns with not just the enemy in mind but also the sky, which seemed to have a particularly cruel sense of humor. A harsh winter could freeze rivers, making it easier to cross without bridges, but also destroy crops, kill livestock, and leave soldiers without food. A rainy summer could turn roads into quagmires, trapping armies, bogging down carts, and rusting armor faster than the soldiers' spirits. These weather conditions forced armies to pause operations, sometimes for months, making the climate as formidable an enemy as any human army. Hey, if you're enjoying this explanation and want to keep learning about the Middle Ages with a dash of humor, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that red button, it doesn't bite, and join the community of curious folks who want to know more about the past without falling asleep. Truces and peace treaties, paradoxically, also prolonged wars. Often, warring sides signed truces to regroup, rebuild armies, raise funds, heal the wounded, or simply catch their breath after years of fighting. But these truces were temporary and fragile, like a sandcastle before the tide comes in. A treaty could collapse because a noble felt insulted, an heir claimed a throne, an ally switched sides, a political marriage failed, or someone wanted revenge for something that happened 20 years ago, like a snarky comment at a banquet or an unpaid debt. The 100 Years' War, for instance, had several major truces, like the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which promised to end the conflict, but none were final, and fighting always resumed, sometimes with greater intensity. It was as if medieval leaders were addicted to war, unable to quit entirely, like someone promising to give up chocolate but always sneaking another piece. These truces not only extended conflicts but sometimes complicated them, as sides used the time to rearm, recruit more soldiers, forge new alliances, plan elaborate betrayals, or just rest and prepare for the next season of chaos. Lastly, we can't overlook the cultural and social impact of long wars. In the Middle Ages, war wasn't just a military event but a way of social cohesion, defining a community, kingdom, or dynasty's identity. Tournaments, the medieval equivalent of the Olympics, trained knights, showcased their skills, let them flaunt shiny armor, prove who had the priciest horse, and win the favor of a lady or the respect of rivals. Tales of martial feats were told in courts, and troubadours composed songs, ballads, and epic poems about heroes fighting for years for their king, lady, god, honor, or just the glory of being mentioned in a song. This glorification of war made conflicts seem noble, heroic, and almost romantic, even when they were a disaster for the population. Peasants, the vast majority, had no say, yet their lives were hit hardest by looting, destruction, forced conscription, famines, and taxes funding these endless wars. For them, war wasn't an epic adventure but an unending nightmare that wrecked their homes, crops, families, and hopes for a quiet life. The feudal structure of medieval society also played a big role. Feudal lords relied on war to maintain power, status, wealth, and the right to strut in courts with embroidered capes and gleaming swords. Without conflicts, how would they justify their castles, armies, grandiose titles, lavish feasts, or collections of armor they probably never wore? A noble without a war to fight was like an influencer without Wi-Fi. They didn't know what to do with themselves. This need to uphold the status quo prolonged conflicts beyond necessity, as surrendering meant losing prestige, lands, allies, respect, or even life. Nobles often used wars to settle personal disputes, like who had rights to a castle, who inherited a piece of land, who married the wrong heiress, or who insulted whom at a tournament. These grudges could keep a conflict alive for generations, like a family argument that never resolves because no one wants to back down, apologize, or talk without a sword in hand. Medieval wars also dragged on because objectives weren't always clear. Today, wars often have defined goals: conquer territory, overthrow a government, secure strategic resources like oil or minerals. In the Middle Ages, the goal was often just to prove superiority, punish a rival, defend family honor, claim a title that sounded good on parchment, or avenge a slight as trivial as a sarcastic remark at dinner. The 100 Years' War, for example, began as a dynastic dispute between the kings of England and France but soon became a struggle for control of rich territories like Aquitaine, which produced wine, a resource nearly as valuable as gold in the Middle Ages, because who wouldn't fight for a good vintage to pair with stale bread and rancid cheese? These vague goals prolonged conflicts, as no one knew exactly when they'd won or when to stop. Sometimes, a war continued simply because no one wanted to be the first to admit they were tired of fighting, out of money, or would rather be home drinking than stuck in the mud. Religion, as mentioned earlier, complicated things further. The Church held immense power in the Middle Ages, and while it preached peace, love, and charity, it didn't always practice what it preached. The Crusades, for instance, were holy wars that spanned generations because religious and political leaders saw them as sacred missions to secure a place in heaven, expand influence, grab land, loot, and prestige, and keep troublesome knights busy abroad. Even in local conflicts, religion could prolong hostilities. Excommunicating a king or noble was like painting a target on their back. Their enemies felt justified in attacking, and the excommunicated had to fight not just for their life, throne, or lands but also for their soul, as no one wanted to go to hell over a misunderstanding with the Pope. The Church also organized truces, like the Truce of God, which limited fighting days, e.g., no combat on Sundays, during religious holidays like Christmas or Lent, or certain times of the year. This sounded good in theory, reducing violence, but in practice, it stretched wars out like chewing gum, as fighting paused and then resumed with more vigor when a permitted day arrived, as if soldiers carried calendars to know when to draw their swords. Fortifications were another key factor. Medieval castles weren't just big houses with pretty towers and colorful banners. They were war machines designed to resist, intimidate, and survive. A well-built castle with thick walls, deep moats, reinforced gates, watchtowers, clever traps, and ample provisions could hold out for years. Defenders had the advantage, staying inside, eating their stores, shooting arrows from the battlements, hurling stones, boiling oil, or anything else at hand, and laughing at attackers dying of hunger, cold, disease, or boredom outside. Building a castle was a huge investment, but it paid off, turning any war into a game of patience where defenders usually held the upper hand. Attackers had to decide if it was worth spending months or years trying to take a fortress or if they should give up and bother a neighbor with a less impressive castle. Some castles, like Dover in England, Carcassonne in France, Croix de Chevaliers in the Holy Land, or Chillon in Switzerland, were so formidable they deterred attackers just by existing, like a neighborhood bully who doesn't need to fight because everyone knows not to mess with them. Taking a castle required not just military might but ingenuity, like digging tunnels to undermine walls, using traitors inside, cutting off water supplies, bribing defenders, or waiting for them to starve. But all these tactics took time, resources, and near superhuman patience. Diplomacy, while it existed, wasn't exactly a refined art. Peace treaties were signed often but broken just as easily, as if written on tissue paper. A marriage between noble families could seal an alliance, unite kingdoms, calm a conflict, or secure an inheritance. But if a spouse died, the marriage produced no heirs, one side felt betrayed, or the father-in-law decided he didn't like the new son-in-law, the alliance crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. Medieval leaders weren't always the best negotiators, either. Many preferred settling disputes with a sword, a joust, or a spectacular siege rather than a quill on parchment, a calm talk, or a handshake. Even when a treaty was signed, it was often just a temporary pause, as sides used the time to rearm, recruit more soldiers, forge new alliances, plan elaborate betrayals, or rest and prepare for the next season of chaos. Medieval diplomacy was like a dance where everyone knew the other was about to step on their toes, but you kept dancing because stopping meant admitting defeat or, worse, getting bored. The feudal economy also limited the ability to wage quick wars. Feudal lords relied on taxes and labor from their peasants, but these couldn't always sustain a long conflict. If a lord took his peasants to war, he left his fields untended, risking famine, revolts, or a harvest so bad even the rats complained. Losing men in battle meant fewer hands to work the land, weakening his position, wealth, and ability to keep fighting. This vicious cycle meant wars were fought in bursts, a year of intense fighting, followed by a year of recovery, then more fighting, and so on, like a wheel spinning but going nowhere. Peasants weren't always thrilled to be dragged into war, either. Many deserted at the first chance, preferring to tend their crops, cows, and families over dying for a noble's dispute they didn't understand, care about, or even know existed. War was also entertainment for the nobility. Tournaments, like mock battles with less blood and more applause, weren't just for training but for showing off the biggest horse, shiniest armor, deadliest swing, fanciest cape, or most epic tale to tell at dinner. These events reinforced the idea that war was glorious, heroic, and almost romantic, though for peasants whose villages were burned, crops destroyed, sons conscripted, and taxes hiked, it probably wasn't as fun. This chivalric mindset kept nobles eager to fight, even without good reason. A knight who didn't fight was seen as shirking duty, like a student skipping homework or a troubadour forgetting lyrics. This social pressure kept conflicts alive, as no one wanted to miss the action, be called a coward, or lose a chance to star in a ballad. The weapons of the time, while impressive for their era, weren't exactly high-tech. A crossbow could be lethal, piercing armor and wreaking havoc, but reloading took so long the archer had to hide behind a shield, say a quick prayer, or run for their life, because they probably needed to. Longbows, like those used by the English in the 100 Years' War, were faster but required years of training, immense strength, and not every army could afford such specialized archers. Swords, spears, maces, and axes were effective in close combat, but there were no weapons of mass destruction to end a battle in a day, like a modern missile or tank. This made wars rely more on endurance, strategy, and patience than brute force. Even when cannons appeared in the 14th century, their early impact was limited. They were slow, inaccurate, prone to exploding in the user's face, required lots of hard-to-get gunpowder, and needed special carts that often got stuck in mud or broke at the worst moment. Transportation was another nightmare. Horses were the main mode of mobility, but not every soldier had one, and those who did had to worry about feeding, caring for, and keeping them healthy and from bolting in the night. A sick, exhausted, or dead horse was a huge loss, as replacing it wasn't as simple as going to a shop, especially mid-war. Roads were often little more than dirt paths full of potholes, rocks, and roots, and in many regions, especially northern Europe, the terrain was swampy, mountainous, forested, or just a mess. Crossing a river, swamp, dense forest, or mountain range could stall an army for days, weeks, or months, giving the enemy time to prepare defenses, set ambushes, hide, or flee, leaving attackers chasing shadows in a landscape that seemed designed to make their lives miserable. Troop morale was also critical. Medieval soldiers didn't always fight for patriotism, a noble cause, loyalty to their king, or kingdom's glory. Many were peasants who just wanted to get home alive and, if possible, with some loot to brag about in the village. A stolen sword, a bit of gold, or an exaggerated tale for the tavern. If a commander couldn't keep troops motivated with promises of wealth, land, women, glory, beer, or divine blessings, desertions were common. When an army started to crumble, the war could drag on, as the enemy exploited weaknesses, set traps, or waited for the other side to self-destruct. Maintaining morale was especially tough in long sieges, where soldiers might spend months camped outside a castle with nothing to do but wait, eat rancid food, dodge stray arrows, deal with mud, fleas, rain, and boredom, which could be more deadly than the enemy itself, as a bored soldier starts thinking desertion isn't such a bad idea. The medieval social structure also prolonged wars. Society was divided into estates, those who prayed, clergy, those who fought, nobles and knights, and those who worked, peasants. Peasants, the vast majority, had no say in war decisions but bore the brunt of their consequences. Fields looted, villages burned, sons conscripted, crops seized, and taxes raised to fund noble campaigns. This bred resentment that, while rarely sparking open revolts, could complicate things for lords. A disgruntled peasant might refuse taxes, sabotage supplies, hide food, join the enemy, or flee to the woods, adding instability to conflicts. Nobles saw war as a chance to gain power, land, prestige, titles, or a wealthy wife, but also a risk, as defeat could cost them everything, from their castle to their head. This tension between estates made wars harder to coordinate, more unpredictable, and thus longer. The lack of a unified legal system also played a role. There was no international code regulating conflicts, like modern international law or the Geneva Conventions. Wars were fought based on local customs, feudal oaths, church laws, and often the whims of the powerful. A noble could justify war by claiming they were defending their honor, avenging a slight, asserting a land claim, or acting on a divine sign from a dream, and no one could challenge them without clear evidence, which was hard to come by in an era without cameras, recorders, or reliable records. This legal ambiguity prolonged conflicts, as there was no neutral arbiter to say, "It's over, go home." Instead, disputes were settled on the battlefield, at the negotiating table, in a deadly duel, or through a series of betrayals, vendettas, and conspiracies that could last generations, like an endless Game of Thrones. Women's influence, often overlooked in historical accounts, also shaped medieval wars. Noble women, queens, duchesses, countesses, or heiresses, could play significant roles in politics and war as regents, mediators, advisors, or even military leaders, like Joan of Arc, who led French troops in the 100 Years' War and became a symbol of resistance. Strategic marriages could unite kingdoms, calm conflicts, secure inheritances, or strengthen alliances, but a failed marriage, lack of heirs, a perceived betrayal, or a disputed dowry, often including valuable lands, could spark war. Figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and then England, showed women could manipulate politics, influence wars, and sometimes prolong conflicts for their own, their families, or their children's interests. However, their influence wasn't always positive, and some noble women were accused of intrigues that further complicated the political landscape, as if the Middle Ages didn't already have enough problems. Geography was another major factor. Medieval Europe was full of natural obstacles: raging rivers, towering mountains, dense forests, treacherous swamps, and plains that turned to mud with the first rain. Moving an army through this terrain was a Herculean task, like running a marathon in lead boots through a minefield. In regions like Scotland, Wales, the Alps, the Pyrenees, or the Carpathians, the terrain could be as formidable as any human foe. Armies had to find safe passes, cross rivers with makeshift bridges that often collapsed, hack through forests teeming with wolves and bandits, or wade through swamps where carts sank like quicksand. Castles and fortified cities were often built in strategic spots, hills, cliffs, islands, or river confluences, making them even harder to take. This blend of geography and fortifications turned every war into a strategy game where patience, planning, and luck were as vital as brute force, numbers, or courage. In conclusion, medieval wars lasted years because they were a perfect storm of logistical chaos, endless sieges, devastating diseases, economic woes, political betrayals, attrition tactics, limited technology, a warrior mindset, slow communications, lack of central authority, unpredictable mercenaries, climate shifts, fragile truces, personal grudges, vague objectives, religion, impregnable fortifications, ineffective diplomacy, a feudal economy, social pressures, primitive weapons, tricky transportation, unstable morale, a rigid social structure, ambiguous laws, women's influence, challenging geography, and a society that saw war as a way of life, an art, and a necessity. Each factor was like an ingredient in a soup nobody wanted to finish but kept stirring, adding more spices, and hoping the flavor would somehow improve. Next time you think of a medieval battle, don't just picture clashing swords, heroic knights, waving banners, and trumpets blaring, but also a bunch of people stuck in a seemingly endless conflict, like a TV series stretched too long because the writers don't know how to end it, the actors are tired, and the fans aren't sure if they want to keep watching. The Middle Ages was a world where patience wasn't just a virtue but a necessity, and wars were the ultimate test of how much kings, nobles, knights, peasants, mercenaries, horses, and even troubadours could endure before saying, enough. Yet, despite it all, those wars left a legacy of epic tales, stunning castles, immortal legends, unforgettable songs, and lessons about human resilience that still resonate today, reminding us that, even in the darkest times, humanity always finds a way to keep going, even if it's at a tortoise's pace, with a rusty sword and a dream of glory. Geography was another major factor. Medieval Europe was full of natural obstacles: raging rivers, towering mountains, dense forests, treacherous swamps, and plains that turned to mud with the first rain. Moving an army through this terrain was a Herculean task, like running a marathon in lead boots through a minefield. In regions like Scotland, Wales, the Alps, the Pyrenees, or the Carpathians, the terrain could be as formidable as any human foe. Armies had to find safe passes, cross rivers with makeshift bridges that often collapsed, hack through forests teeming with wolves and bandits, or wade through swamps where carts sank like quicksand. Castles and fortified cities were often built in strategic spots, hills, cliffs, islands, or river confluences, making them even harder to take. This blend of geography and fortifications turned every war into a strategy game where patience, planning, and luck were as vital as brute force, numbers, or courage. In conclusion, medieval wars lasted years because they were a perfect storm of logistical chaos, endless sieges, devastating diseases, economic woes, political betrayals, attrition tactics, limited technology, a warrior mindset, slow communications, lack of central authority, unpredictable mercenaries, climate shifts, fragile truces, personal grudges, vague objectives, religion, impregnable fortifications, ineffective diplomacy, a feudal economy, social pressures, primitive weapons, tricky transportation, unstable morale, a rigid social structure, ambiguous laws, women's influence, challenging geography, and a society that saw war as a way of life, an art, and a necessity. Each factor was like an ingredient in a soup nobody wanted to finish but kept stirring, adding more spices, and hoping the flavor would somehow improve. Next time you think of a medieval battle, don't just picture clashing swords, heroic knights, waving banners, and trumpets blaring, but also a bunch of people stuck in a seemingly endless conflict, like a TV series stretched too long because the writers don't know how to end it, the actors are tired, and the fans aren't sure if they want to keep watching. The Middle Ages was a world where patience wasn't just a virtue but a necessity, and wars were the ultimate test of how much kings, nobles, knights, peasants, mercenaries, horses, and even troubadours could endure before saying, enough. Yet, despite it all, those wars left a legacy of epic tales, stunning castles, immortal legends, unforgettable songs, and lessons about human resilience that still resonate today, reminding us that, even in the darkest times, humanity always finds a way to keep going, even if it's at a tortoise's pace, with a rusty sword and a dream of glory.